Greetings, welcome to the Dialectic. This is a podcast by the Rajput and the Wasp. I'm Atul Singh, with me is Carle. Now, you might have heard about our podcast in our previous episode in which we introduced it. Today, we are getting into the swing of things. Today is our first substantive discussion. Now, before we carry on, you must know that Glenn is a scholar, he is an athlete, he served in the CIA many years, and today morning I woke up to see him sitting on his table with the complete works of Montaigne in French under his eyes, under his bespectacled eyes, now that he's older. And we got cracking before too long, actually, over breakfast and thereafter, about a discussion on democracy. And today's discussion will be on democracy. Is democracy in danger? And Glenn will bring you the perspective from America, from Europe. He is an American trained in the European humanist tradition. And of course, Glenn will tell you a bit about me, and I will bring you the perspective from the East, presumably a bit from the West too.
Well, I guess once an athlete, always an athlete, which is I can claim and hold on to. But I'm afraid, if I'm honest, I have to admit that my athleticism consists perhaps of walking my dog and eating potato chips now. So I have to return to previous ways in order to not feel terrible about myself in that regard. But I certainly was an athlete. That's true. Now, Atul may have found me reading Montaigne, but I found him doing a headstand, so he certainly gets the honors for athleticism now.
Well, I suppose now that you know that one reads Montaigne and the other likes headstands, we can get cracking. Prima facie, democracy is doing well. Prima facie, you could say. Africa has decolonized. Some countries have elections, messy though they may be. South Africa no longer has apartheid. Instead, it has majority rule, which was inconceivable as early or as late as 1991. It's only by 1994 or so that South Africa became a democracy. East Asia no longer has military dictatorships. Taiwan has elections. South Korea has elections. Japan, of course, has had elections for a while. Eastern Europe is no longer under the boot of the Soviet Union. Latin America is no longer suffering from the CIA-led coups anymore, or for that matter,
Fights for freedom, you might
thanks
say.
to freedom. Exactly.
Fights for freedom.
Fights for freedom, exactly. Or for that matter, Soviet-inspired insurrections, or they would say a revolutionary, popular uprising for utopian world that they sought to create.
I hope the listeners understand that I am being facetious.
I hope so too. But anyway, so in a way, you could say Francis Fukuyama may be right. We may be in the early days of the end of history. And why is it that a chap from the East and a chap from the West who have both crisscrossed East and West, are now talking about democracy? Are we both fuddy-duddies, or is there something going on, Glenn?
Well, I think from the broad view of human history, that your characterization is undeniable. Today, in the world, this has been measured empirically by many. Without question, more people enjoy more rights, more governments are rules and legally bound than at any time in human history.
People live longer too. Women have the vote. Many things.
People are wealthier by all measures. People are healthier. People have more individual rights. There is less violence, whether it be local violence, domestic violence, interstate violence, than at any time in history. All of that is true. It's also true, if we take a slightly less meta perspective, unfortunately, that democracies are struggling, and that there are social stresses globally, certainly in America, in Europe, and in all societies, not just democratic, but in all democratic societies today, that are functions of current sociological trends, technological trends that stress democracies and place them under challenge. I used to take what is fundamentally the American default assumptions, a Whiggish view of history, that it is progressive and moving forward to the broad, sunlit uplands that Churchill would talk about during World War II. Um, However, I don't any longer subscribe to that with as much confidence. I now take a more cyclical, almost cyclical view, or rather, my view of human nature is somewhat different. That, of course, it is consistent. The ancient Greeks speak to me and to all of us today, because although they wrote 2,700 or 2,400 years ago, they are fundamentally the same as we are, just living in different social, technological circumstances. So I find that there is a clear phase now where the internal contradictions of aspirations for individual rights, um, competing with the urge of social dynamics, which are fundamentally tribal, unfortunately, but truthfully, are leading to serious stresses. And the most glaring example, of course, is that we had Donald Trump as an American fascist, lacking any objectives really other than power, and to represent the anger, resentments, fears, and demands of a specific ethnic racial group in the United States. And that you see similar trends in Poland, in Hungary, in Turkey, in France, in Germany, across the democratic world. You see now disaggregation socially, or strains at least, that are certainly stressing the success of democracies.
Well, I mean, you spoke of um, ancient Athens, and as you remember, I was on Capitol Hill that day on January 6th, and I took my father's advice and started rereading Plato, and I have a 1987 edition of the Republic, which was translated by Sir Desmond Lee, the late classicist, and in the introduction he talks about Plato living in an age which had abandoned its traditional moral code but found it impossibly difficult to create a new one. And Athenian democracy basically had degenerated into chaos and dissension. Uh, Remember, this is a democracy that also forces Socrates, arguably the founder of Western philosophy, to drink hemlock. So it has happened before that democracies, even small democracies, have fallen prey to the great unraveling. They have degenerated into discord. They have been dogged by dysfunction, and they have become plagued by mob rule. The Roman Republic also went the Athenian way. At some point, oligarchs took charge. They controlled all the land. Form triumphed over substance. Democratic institutions decayed. Populists emerged to lead the mob. Of course, there were various ones. One of the better known was Tiberius Gracchus, who attempted agrarian reform, assembled a mob on the Capitol, but was clubbed to death in the Senate. So, in a way, this is nothing new. But what you allude to, the disintegration of society, um, that seems to be happening after a period of post-war calm, and especially after the period of great hope when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And this is what led Francis Fukuyama to talk about the end of history, and he thought a liberal democracy would be the final sort of achievement of humanity. But in that promise lay a peril. The promise of democracy came with a great peril, because the common bonds that tie society together are no longer the same, as you have said. And we are seeing populism, we are seeing anger, inequality has gone up, social mobility has gone down. In fact, America now has lower social mobility than Europe, which uh, is a frightening idea, given the fact that America was based on this idea of the great American dream. So all of this is not very healthy for democracy per se.
Yeah, well, what is happening, I think, your example in democracies, your example of ancient Greece and Rome is apt, and it's not because I'm a fuddy-duddy classicist. The classicists speak to us because they lived before our time the same stresses and problems that we now know as humans trying to organize ourselves into society. So, what is democracy? Democracy is a structure of government that enables the competing factions and groups in a society to adjudicate and share power without the use of violence. The only authorized use of violence in a successful state, and certainly in a democracy, is held by the government itself. When that breaks down, when one faction becomes intransigent, refuses to accept the peaceful alternation or competition and sharing of power, you have violence. Socrates had to drink the hemlock because the conservative optimates, I think they were called, that might be
that is Roman times.
With the Romans,
yes. The Romans were the optimates.
The conservative faction that Plato, frankly, represents. I'm not a huge fan of Plato. Was triumphant and suppressed the challenge of the other faction. They were able to do so. The Roman Republic fell not because Caesar was a totalitarian and a dictator, but because Caesar triumphed shortly, but ultimately his faction lost well after his assassination in a clash between the optimates and the plebeians, and the broad social groups that had been, they weren't disenfranchised. They never had the franchise. They were totally exploited. This is the slave class and the what we would now call the working class or the peasant class, and it was the triumph, more than had been the case, of the ruling elites who held on to all of the power and all of the capital that led to revolution. Caesar saw that the only way to save Rome was to reform the Republic. And of course, that meant to take away the control from some of the ruling elite factions, and they assassinated him while believing that they were protecting democracy. For them, democracy was the rule of themselves. Today, it's the same story. We aren't having a course in ancient history here. Now, what's happened in the United States, which is representative, really, not unique, of the stresses on democracy everywhere, as the if you say ruling elite, it's misleading because that implies powerful, rich people. As the ruling, culturally determinating class, which is frankly the white race, is challenged in its historic preeminence. Even if they were poor, they defined what it was to be American and who got to say what about what. Loses power, frankly, to other groups, be they black or female or foreign or other economic power centers. That creates resentment. Paradoxically, perversely, triumphantly, but tragically, the success of the American experiment, of the democratic experiment, of giving power to all individuals and all groups equally, as it progressively comes closer. Parenthetically, for the first time in history in America, there is now reasonable opportunity for a black American to succeed in mainstream society. That was not the case when I was growing up, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have resentment, and you have the tribune of the angry, which represents those who perceive themselves to be losing their power, Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or the National Front in France, and so on. And so the success of democracy contains the seeds of its stress and the challenge to it that we're living.
So you've hit upon something very pertinent in terms of racial diversity. America of today is very different to the America of your childhood.
Mm.
Completely different. You see Asians on television, African Americans on television. The new James Bond movie has a tall West African woman who is the new 007. And this was inconceivable in the days of Sean Connery.
Inconceivable.
Yeah. So that's all good. But what has also happened, particularly at the level of the primary schools or across the rest of the country, is sadly an emaciation of opportunities. Because what has happened is that, yes, whilst racially you're absolutely right, someone like me as an immigrant can come and start Fair Observer. What is also true that if you're born on the wrong side of the tracks in West Virginia, or for that matter in Mississippi, or for that matter in South Dakota, the American economy and the American society is no longer running public schools the way it used to. So you do not have the GI Bill anymore. Colleges become more expensive. So you look at 60% of Americans, they have $500, which can they don't have $500, which can cover a sudden expense.
I'd heard 400 actually. But,
well, it may be 4. I mean, this is from 2017. So what is clear is that inequality has gone up, social mobility has gone down. 2 points I've already made. But what has also happened is that the great American dream for a lot of poorer people is under threat. And when they see some communities do well, such as the Jewish community, the Indian American community, the Chinese American community, the Korean American community, they feel resentful.
Yes.
That combination is not ideal. And also, I think, with greater diversity, the common bonds have frayed a bit. That they have also been helped by the privatization of the commons. So you get a lot of identity politics today, which leads to deepening of fissures and just pressures in society.
Absolutely. Fundamentally, when the pie is expanding, then even if the pie is not perfectly baked, everyone can have a broader piece, or at least hope to.
Absolutely.
And that was the case more in America than any other society in history until
after World War II,
until 1980. You can almost date it precisely, and we have been misled by the happy historic aberration of America from 1933, really 1945, until 1980, when there was truly greater opportunity for all levels. It might have been unequal amounts of benefit, but there was, as President Kennedy said, a rising tide raises all boats. Now, people had different sized boats, but there was opportunity. Why did this occur? It occurred because, and this is established empirically, Thomas Piketty has written extensively about this, and it's definitive.
The French
He's
economic
a
historian.
French economic historian.
For our listeners.
For almost the only time in history, from 1945 until 1980, there was social reallocation, redistribution, and the working class came to have progressively greater power because it had a greater share of the national pie. That led to the greater opportunity. At the same time, we've spoken about the changes in sociology in American society. At the same time that those changes occurred, this redistribution, greater equity stopped. And what has happened is that America has reverted to, unfortunately, historic norms of societies. The American pattern is identical to that of ancient Rome and every other society, which means the concentration of wealth. I think Atul mentioned that something like 2% of the population controls 60% or 50% of all wealth.
I haven't yet mentioned it. I think I mentioned it in our earlier conversation, but 10% of Americans own 84% of all shares in the US, and the top 1% own about 50% of shares.
So,
And 50%
right.
of Americans own almost no stocks at all.
Well, stocks may be a little misleading.
Yeah.
No capital.
That's true.
They have no resources.
Exactly. And they don't even have $500 in savings.
Yeah. And so when that happens at the same time that the foundations of the national myth in society, and I don't say myth in a pejorative way at all,
Yeah.
What gave American society cohesion and a sense of purpose and opportunity, as those foundations change demographically, the opportunities that created literally a halcyon 2 generations no longer obtain. And when you have lack of opportunity with revolutionary social change, you will have almost revolutionary resentments. And thus you have a reaction. You have Donald Trump, you have Viktor Orban, and democracy is stressed by, perversely, partially the success of the ideal combined with the failure of its economic model of creating opportunity instead of concentration of wealth.
And so you talked about concentration of wealth. Are the current elites, in particular the financial elites who profited most from it, to blame? Because if we look at the way the economy is structured, the way they've benefited from loose monetary policies such as quantitative easing and rising capital prices, is it that this failure of elites is what is leading to so much of anger? Because if you go back to
it's the success of the elites which leads to social failure. And the selfishness of people, and those who have more take more,
yeah,
and consider it theirs and don't want to give up what they have. This is human nature. But if you have $1 billion, you have more power than someone with $400.
Yeah, but let me push back. Your father fought in World War II. Your grandfather fought in World War I. So I'm not saying everything was hunky-dory. After all, there were world wars. But the elites then had a noblesse oblige. They were willing to fight and die for something they believed in. Your father spent his life promoting public education. Today, of course, instead of people championing public education, the elites send their kids to private school, or they send them to schools in very posh districts.
Well, I think you're projecting my natural personal excellence back on my family heritage. When my father would snort and be derisive if anyone characterized him, his family, or my grandfather as members of the elite.
Oh, well, they weren't elite.
One would hope representatives of a meritocratic society where effort and talent can succeed, but certainly they were not members of the haves.
They weren't the Brahmins, the Boston Brahmins. I understand, but
they were wasps.
They were wasps, exactly.
And who would want to be anything else?
Exactly. So let's talk about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in World War I and World War II. And yes, they were the dominant elite, but to be fair to them, 1920, under their watch, votes came to women. 1945, they put their lives on the line and they created a post-war order. They acted out of altruism. Yes, it's become fashionable to say everyone acts in their own selfish interest, but I think human beings are a curious combination of both selfishness and altruism. And I think at various points the Greeks have this fantastic term called kairos. There's chronos, which is chronological, and kairos, where you can bend the arc of time to your will. And at points of kairos, I would argue that far-seeking elites have been willing to act not for private benefit, but for public welfare. And the Romans always said that if you had public squalor and private splendor, then something was rotting in society. And when I travel around America, and I've driven across America 4 times, when I go to San Francisco in particular, and I see the grim homelessness combined with the lavish opulence, somehow something doesn't quite stick.
Well, I think 2 points, and maybe we are running out of time. I defer to you on that, but I would have 2 possibly final thoughts that I think are directly relevant. Max Weber, whom I admire tremendously, he hasn't so much fallen out of favor as fallen, I think, out of his central position in sociology as when I was in college. Nonetheless, Max Weber studied what is it that led to the Puritan, the Protestant Anglo-Saxon success,
Yeah.
economically,
The Protestant
socially,
work ethic
politically.
and the spirit of capitalism. It's a classic.
And he argued, I think pretty compellingly, that the quote secret to their success, social success, was deferred gratification. It doesn't make sense to not eat the banana you pull down from a tree, because there it is, and it won't last. But if you defer some of your gratification, you actually develop savings, and you become stronger, have more possibilities in the future than you would otherwise. And that seems to be the difference between economically dynamic societies and societies that have traditional practices where consumption, people work to meet their immediate needs and then, relatively speaking, stop. So this deferred gratification seems not to, because of part of the structures of society and our political system, doesn't seem to have as much hold on the American culture and or perhaps on democracy,
any culture today.
On any culture, as
it's consumerism worldwide.
As previously. And the second thing is, when I graduated from Harvard, is I remember one sentence from the remarks of the Harvard president, whose name was Derek Bok at the time. This goes back 45 years or whatever it is, but no matter. And he said, "Welcome to the community of educated men and women, where you have now learned some of those healthy constraints that make us free," which means that unless you accept bounds to your freedom and to what you may have and do, all will suffer, and society becomes more selfish, avaricious, and less functioning. And this sounds like a social conservative perspective. I don't think that I am, but I think those two attributes, because of social and structural changes to our political system, no longer obtain as much, and we're struggling as a result.
Yeah, and we'll carry on for a bit because we are having such an interesting conversation. And I would talk about social media. The 2 points you said touched directly upon social media. And it's not that tabloids didn't exist before. It is not that propaganda didn't exist before. It is not that deceit or falsehood didn't exist before. But what social media has done today is filled all these fires, and they spread faster and more virally, to use a social media term, and more destructively. And to give the example of the British East India Company, which is very apt as far as I'm concerned, social media also relies on addiction. They get you to spend as much time for as much content as possible and suck away your data. And once they have got your attention and they have your data, then they can sell you ads. And this addictive economy, and there have been many controversies, there have been hearings in the Senate, there have been hearings in Singapore, in the UK, and this phenomenon has led to what some would call the post-truth world. So do you think, given the very nature of social media, where people are not meeting in person, where a sense of community, in-person community, has got diluted, where people are living in a virtual universe, and now, of course, Facebook is called Meta. Do we have an unprecedented pressure on and threat to democracy, as actually an internet entrepreneur, Pierre Omidyar, himself wrote in the Washington Post, I believe, a few years ago?
But I think we are, and I don't think democracy is possible. I don't think any society can function, whatever its political structures, unless there is a broadly speaking accepted national narrative and social consensus. Now, it doesn't mean everyone has to be the same at all. One hopes not. The consensus could be that diversity is acceptable. But when the consensus is that diversity is a threat to us and makes you an other, then society becomes violent and breaks down. So I think what is happening is that we're having, in a ironic, tragic evolution, we're having the triumph of individualism, which is the foundation of Western society, something I champion and prize. All of us, I think, do in our societies, most of all of us. but where everyone is equal, where is the truth, and who gets to shape how we should function? So our triumph leads to tensions. Secondly, what you touched upon, fundamental, we're living literally a revolution socially because of technological change, which is the social media and the digitization of individual interactions. All of us have experience and are familiar with the concept of road rage. And why does this happen? Road rage happens because individuals sit in the cubicle of their vehicle. They don't know the people around them in the other cars, and they therefore have no unconscious social obligations to behave in a civilized way and to defer, to seek communal positions. They just react viscerally, instinctively, in isolated individual ways. Similarly, this happens with social media. And thus we have, at first I was bemused why there was such concern about bullying among our children on social media. And I thought we all grew up in the playgrounds. And of course, humans always will seek a pecking order and be nasty to one another sometimes. And you'll have friends and enemies and so on. And so that's part of growing up. But actually,
we both grew up with the odd punch up.
Absolutely, which was a socially healthy way of establishing one's individuality and sense of self and how one fit in or didn't or what one had to do to get along in society. But all of these things now are done in a way that creates social enemy and a lack of the unconscious and conscious assumptions of how one should behave. I think a good example of what's happening throughout society is I was on a tourist boat in France many years ago, and there was a Japanese tourist group, and they were behaving, frankly, like monsters. They were just gross in their behavior, disturbing everyone around them. It was shocking.
The Japanese are generally known to be very polite.
Well, and why was that the case? I finally was so upset that I said, I spoke directly to one of them, and I said, "Stop this." I said, "You're really being rude." And he was mortified because all of a sudden I had broken the bubble and I had become a human being to whom he had obligations. And instantaneously, their group behavior became absolutely model behavior. They were mortified that they had acted in a way inconsiderate of the people around them. But until they had established this human connection, we did not exist as people. That's what happens in the car. That's what happens in social media. And that leads to individual horrific behavior, destructive. It leads to tribalism, where groups feel threatened by the outsider. And that destroys social consensus, damages the possibility of successful democracy. And this is happening as our society goes through the revolution of social change, and by increasing opportunity, we also are creating tensions.
That's something very interesting you're touching upon, tribalism fed by algorithms, echo chambers, filter bubbles. These days, if you watch something on YouTube, which is a great source of information, but also if you watch one football video, it throws a million other football videos at you. If you watch a Steve Bannon video, which I've watched all of his interviews on YouTube.
I must move away.
Yes, you probably must. It's very educational and instructive, but that is because YouTube then decides to spit out every single of those types of videos. Now, when that happens, then you are creating this extraordinary vortex. You're creating a vortex in which suddenly people only engage with people like them. They only see information that is true to them. And then you get this echo chamber where what's true? Is it what Albert Einstein posited, or is it what, let's say, Joe the Plumber says? The Earth could be flat.
Donald Trump.
Well, yes, and this is the
great sage.
Yeah, and this is the perfect fill for identity politics, which is plaguing much of America. And it's not just Steve Bannon and people on the right. I mean, the illiberalism in American universities, the woke self-righteousness that exists today is frightening as well. It's very reminiscent of the reign of terror in some ways, the intolerance of the reign of terror,
Yes.
or for that matter, communists
in the 1930s.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, as you've talked about a lot, there has been a thickening of processes in democracy. Democracy costs a lot. I come from India. Today, to stand for election in India is a huge capital expense, and which is why so many of the people getting into politics in India are people not exactly of squeaky clean backgrounds. A record number of criminals have entered the fray. Here as well, politicians or congressmen are fundraising 60 to 70% of the time, and every 2 years they are running. And yes, American constitution makers were people of great foresight, and we still have the First Republic here, whilst in France you have the Fifth Republic, but they did not envisage non-stop attack ads, non-stop fundraising, and very little legislation or questioning of the executive. What has happened is a triumph of interest groups in many democracies. If you cut through the noise, if democracy, in to use words of Shakespeare, has become full of sound and fury, sometimes, not always, signifying nothing. And yet it is a beautiful and treasured form of government, which, when it works, is spectacularly better than the Xi Jinping model.
Yeah, I don't think the Founding Fathers misunderstood. I think they actually assessed correctly and designed the system well.
I didn't say they misunderstood, but I said they couldn't envisage this world.
To adjudicate the clash of factions. That was explicitly what they were up to do.
Yeah.
They assumed that factions and elites would always rule. What the system isn't designed to do. So they designed it to address a certain kind of society. But it's not designed to address a revolutionary social situation, which is what I think all societies in the modern technological and progressively diverse world, sociologically, are experiencing, and how one can peacefully, democratically change a social paradigm and transfer power from one faction to others. Almost no society has successfully ever managed to do that.
So how do we succeed in preserving democracy? What would you say? What would be your thoughts to reassure our listeners so that they don't get too depressed and start drinking too much vodka or whiskey?
Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't even drink Diet Coke.
Or Coke.
Or Coke. Which now will be sued or something because we've disparaged the foundation of American commerce. I don't know. Well, my hope, I guess, hopeful perspective would be if our system of government can succeed in creating a system that redistributes wealth a small amount and at least stops the progressive concentration thereof, that would then give hope, it would give opportunity and thus hope to a much broader segment of society. That's what stopped roughly in 1980, and it was, unfortunately for everyone, the fact that there was some meaningful redistribution and greater opportunity for the masses post-World War II is historically an aberration, but it at least is possible, and I think necessary for the successful functioning of a democracy.
Excellent. So if we could have less concentration of wealth, and if we could have more opportunity and greater social mobility, and a sense of common purpose in society, then we could still have a decent democracy. And on the whole, there is something to look forward to in large parts of the world. People are voting for the first time. They are experiencing great upheaval in a country like India. You're seeing elections wherein people like Mamata Banerjee or in West Bengal or Narendra Modi, both of whom come from humble backgrounds, or even Arvind Kejriwal. These are all first generation politicians. They are not fifth generation Skyans, unlike the Nehru family. So there is a great democratization happening in some parts of the world, if not all parts of the world. And maybe that is something that will happen all over the world. And as long as we can curb the excesses, we might be all right.
Long term, yeah, all change, any change is stressful, and we're experiencing, I think, literally, by the definitions, revolutionary social changes in just about every society now,
and technological and economic.
Yes, most of which individually are good changes, but together cause stress, and people lash out when stressed and when things change, even if for the better. Even change for the better makes people unhappy.
All right, this is it from the two of us, the Rashput and the Wasp, the Dialectic, a podcast by Fair Observer. Please sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and engage in the conversation. Let us know what we should talk about next. We look forward to seeing you again. All the best, wherever in the world you happen to be. And bye for now.
Until next time.